AP US History Review, Lesson 33, Diplomacy Between the Wars. Now, between the wars, we're talking about World War I and World War II, this in-between period of peace that's kind of bookended by the two most massive conflicts of the 20th century. And so after World War I, to begin looking at our diplomacy to set the stage for this diplomacy of the era, after World War I and beginning with Warren Harding in 1920, the United States repudiated this whole notion of missionary zeal, this whole notion of warring crusades, wars to end wars, and huge military expenditures. It's a rejection of Wilson and his entire League of Nations model. What we wanted instead was this notion of normalcy, this notion of domestic focus, this notion of going back to Washington's farewell address, no entangling alliances, no binding commitments overseas. So although the United States was the dominant economic, financial, industrial power of the globe, we rejected or did not seek to have a role as this international policymaker of the globe if we could avoid it. So instead, we talked in code of what we would have referred to as the time period of the United States as isolationism. The United States pledged now not to be involved in old world affairs. And I'm very specific in my terminology there. I say old world affairs because anything that happens in North and South America does not count as old world affairs. And in that regard, our sphere of influence in Latin America was definitely something, even at the height of the isolationist movement, we were certainly going to preserve if at all possible, and at all costs. In terms of our sphere of influence in Latin America, isolationism did not extend to this hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, the Platt Amendment, the Roosevelt correlated the Monroe Doctrine, all were in play largely as the 1920s began. The idea that this was our sphere and really did not want external European meddling in the Western Hemisphere. Now, that being said, in the interwar years, we did see a movement, a transition away from the gunboat diplomacy or the big stick of Theodore Roosevelt to what Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s would call PanAmericanism, or better yet, being a good neighbor, the so-called good neighbor policy. Translation, the United States would not send the troops in as much, not if it was possibly avoidable. We did, however, wind up training many of the governments there in terms of establishing and setting up a number of dictators in Latin America who did run their countries, or at least ran their foreign policies in a way that was beneficial or friendly to the United States. So in places such as Nicaragua and Haiti and Cuba, the Somoza regime in Nicaragua ruled through corruption, suppression, and torture from 1936 all the way up to the 70s. And the U.S. would occupy Haiti until 1934 itself. We were never successful in Americanizing them, though, despite our attempts. The Cubans grew restless under our occupation. Ultimately, we negated the Platt Amendment, still keeping our base in Guantanamo Bay that we'd had, but negated all the other elements of the Platt Amendment about interfering in their affairs and engaging ourselves in not allowing them to approve any international agreements without our prior approval. So we do see steps in this direction. Much of the 1930s movement towards these steps was because of our fears of what was going on with the fascists in Europe and wanting to present a strong common front here in the New World. But the main goal of American foreign policy during this time period, in many ways, would be to try to find non-military means to exercise power whenever possible. This was the lesson we thought we'd learned from World War I. So conferences, moral lectures, calls for peace, non-recognition of regimes we didn't approve of, arms control, and economic and financial ties were all in line with the principle of the open door, but also all in line with free economic trade, but a minimal amount of foreign policy military footprint. And so as we move to the search for peace and order in the 1920s, this world of war, the world that hopefully has been created where there will be no more war, which you and I know a whole lot different, the more accurate description of our foreign policy then is not going to be what I would call isolationism. It's fair to say that we were independent internationalists. And what I mean by this is that the United States was active. We were very active in terms of global commitments and on a global scale in terms of finance, in terms of agreement, in terms of disarmament, and obviously in terms of the Western Hemisphere. But we wanted to retain our independence of interaction, of action. In other words, we were active on the global scale, but not in the context of the League of Nations. We weren't going to be bound or constrained in that manner. For proof of this, you need to look no further than things such as the Washington Naval Conference Treaty, which was the world's first major disarmament treaty. The United States discussed with 8 other nations limits on naval weapons. The 5-Power Treaty, which came out of these conferences, set a 10-year holiday on battleship construction and set ratios for the construction of battleships for Italy, Great Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. Disarmament being one of the major goals of the era, which was an anti-war era, an anti-commitment era, reduce the military forces. was very much in line with what American policymakers were thinking during this time. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, which had the nickname, I guess, sort of references an international kiss, 62 nations signed this, which was to condemn recourse to war. In other words, we were trying to make war illegal. Now, this is purely symbolic, I would argue, and historians argue, because you can't make war immoral, or illegal, rather. You can't make war illegal if somebody declares war on you first. It's not like you're just going to sit there and take it and let yourself get attacked. So it's more symbolic than it is an actual substantive policy agreement. But it shows you the tenor of the 1920s, which was about after the horrors of the trenches of World War I. The Western democracies wanted to put themselves in a position to never have war again. And they initially did this by never wanting to talk about war again, never wanting to engage in anything that could lead to war again. So it's a policy of non-confrontation and of acceptance of the world as it is, irrespective of what the world does. Obviously, when it comes to the League of Nations, the United States refused to join. Smoot-Hawley tariff was economic nationalism at work in this search for peace and order, as the United States focused on normalcy, focused on domestic concerns and priorities. The impact of our not allowing the rest of the world to trade with us didn't really enter into our calculus, and it did not enter into our considerations of what was good in terms of international stability. What was good for us was high protective tariffs, at least good for corporate America, so these tariffs were passed. When it came to the war debt, there was a lot of dissatisfaction and even anger on the part of our allies that we refused to forgive any of the war debt that we had to the French and British. The reason being is, as Calvin Coolidge famously said, well, they hired the money, didn't they? Translation, you borrowed it from us, you're going to pay it back. So the notion of allies as allies, forgiving these war debts, letting bygones be bygones, or at least washing some away out of the arm-in-arm struggle they had against the Germans, that got absolutely nowhere. So we refused to forgive the Allied war debts to England and France. As a result, England and France definitely made sure that they were going to get every penny of reparations out of the Germans, who, as you recall from earlier lessons, were given responsibility, sole guilt and responsibility for the war, and were going to pay reparations, pay damages to everyone else as a result. Germany couldn't do this, so through the Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929, their debt programs were kind of re-amortized. They were kind of refinanced, if you will, and put on separate payment plans. This resulted in the aforementioned financial merry-go-round from our earlier units on the Great Depression, where the U.S. loaned money to the Germans, who then paid that money back as reparations to Britain and France, who then paid that money back to the United States to pay off their war debt. This sort of financial merry-go-round will only last as long as the United States is economically in a position to continue foreign aid to Germany. The Great Depression will stop that, obviously. Germany will ultimately, these war debts get scaled back and reduced. Germany will ultimately default or skip out on the rest. And increasingly, America's high tariffs, thanks to the Hawley-Smoot tariff, made it hard for Europe to generate the money necessary, the currency necessary, to pay back the debts that it owed to the United States. So that complicated some things considerably in terms of financial stability. Now, in the 1930s, the common parlance is that World War II begins in 1939 with Adolf Hitler invading Poland. The internationalist school of history now argues that World War II actually begins a little earlier, perhaps definitely 1937 with the Sino-Japanese War, and perhaps even earlier into 1931 with Japanese activities in Manchuria. Now, what happens in Manchuria? If you can follow along on our maps here. In Manchuria, which is this region here, the Japanese in the 30s began extending their influence as trying to seize and expand territory for themselves. They declare war on this area and set up the puppet state of which they called Manchukuo. The United States doesn't like this. We disagree with it. We think it's wrong. We think it's an aggressor nation attacking and wantonly taking land from another nation. But at the height of the 1930s isolationist movement, the 1920s movement, with this Great Depression, are we in a position to do anything about this? No. So all we do is, Secretary of State Stimson says the United States will not recognize these conquests. This is the so-called Stimson Doctrine or non-recognition doctrine, which is about as useful as somebody taking your wallet or your purse and running away from you and you yelling at them, stop. And if you don't stop, I'll just yell stop one more time. It's largely a symbolic measure. It's a measure of us saying, nope, not recognizing it. Didn't happen, didn't exist, we don't see it, it's not there. Which in a practical sense does nothing. The Japanese have boots on the ground, we don't, so it continues in many ways. This is the moral lecture component of American foreign policy during this time. If we're not going to actually directly engage and forcibly militarily stop these kinds of incursions, all we can do is say that we don't believe it exists and we don't recognize it anymore.